Hi. Okay, so this video is on polling. Woohoo! Um, so the reason I'm doing this video on polling is, well, number one, it's just because I like it. Um, uh, yeah, like polls. I wrote a graduate thesis on public opinion polls. So it's an area that I know a bit about. Again, not an expert, but I can swim. And the other reason, more pertinent, I guess, to other people, is that it's hard to have like a real discussion about contemporary American politics without discussing polls and what their role is, what's happening in them, and sort of how exactly they're being used to like theoretically measure public opinion, but more so, even I think it's direct public opinion. And that's the sticky issue. But we'll take a step back. and and I'll talk a little bit about them for those who like don't know the intricacies of polling methodology and data. Um, so something to look forward to. Stick around. Uh, I guess the place to start though is like the state of the industry, right? What exactly are we talking about here, and what are we dealing with, and why even are we having this conversation? There does tend to be a broad-based, you know, American sense that polls are all BS. You know, they've had some major misses. They don't mean anything. And yet our media still talks about them all the time. And you can't escape any election coverage without polling numbers, right? Without polls being cited, without numbers being cited, without demographics being talked about. So, whatever your opinion is on their accuracy or lack thereof, you the fact that they are a part of this ecosystem is undeniable, right? They have their place, they're in it. We are forced to hear people talk about them. So let's talk about that. So like, what's going on here? Why are they so bad? Why are they so wonderful? And is there a middle ground, or is there a solution? And kind of what's going to happen in the age of AI? Now, I'm going to start this conversation not with like a methodological dissection, but more so with the way that polls get treated and discussed in the media, because that is the actual problem. Yes, polling has its issues. Again, I'll get there. Don't you worry. But the real issue here is the way that they are talked about and represented. And for this, like, yes, of course, there are the pundits who are like, Biden's ahead, has flown ahead of Trump with 3 points in the latest polls, and the red wave is coming, according to all the polls, and 72% of Americans think that Biden's too old to be running again. So I made all that up, by the way, not actually quoting any numbers there. So that's one thing, right? It's the one thing. It's the way that polls are discussed in the media. And this is, sensationalism, wanting to get your attention, clicks, whatever. Media's going to do what media does. And I don't think that I really need to go into that because, that's part of the larger story of just the decline of journalism. But to me, the bigger sort of, I don't want to say, the bigger uh, antagonist in this story are the actual pollsters, because y'all know better, all right? And when you put out a headline that says Biden now leads Trump by 2 points in latest poll, you know that means nothing. 2 points is within a margin of error. 2 points in a non-representative sample is basically nothing. And so when you put out these stories that say that so and so is up 2 points, 3 points, even 5 points, really, you are misleading the public. And you're deliberately misleading the public because you know something that they don't know. Because the public sees numbers and they think that those numbers are accurate, because that's what we're told, that math is math, that 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? And that numbers add up to something and there are meaning behind those numbers. But what you know and what I know is that polling isn't actually math. I mean, yes, there is math involved in it, but just like anybody who has taken a graduate level statistics class, there are no numbers in that. You're not to assign a 34.2. Oh my God, when they add the decimal in these polls, that just enrages me. Side note, ugh, how dare you? How dare you? But anyway, as I was saying, when you treat these polls as though they are exact numerical representatives, and even worse, you use those numerical representatives to compare sentiments or people or policies, you are painting a very, very different picture than what the data is actually giving you. And this is the disconnect, right? So to step that back a little bit and to talk about why it is that 2 points is basically useless, are, you've got two kind of big things. Number one is the margin of error. And margin of error is a simple mathematical calculations that all polls get, and no matter, even like the best, most representative poll will still have a margin of error of like 2 to 5 points, right? Depending on the sample size, depending on the questions, and I'm sure there's other things, but in general, right, you've got a margin of error. So this exists across even the best polls, right? And so even if you have highly, highly, highly accurate polls and you're asking like 100 men, 130-year-old white men, same income, whether they like blue or green more or whatever, you're still going to have some margin of error, right? It'll be small, but you'll have some. Sorry, God, I'm gonna someone. Oh, no one's gonna come out here with this. There are caveats in that, but it doesn't matter. So even saying people are 2 points ahead or have their approval rating has gone up 3 points, like even that is dicey, all right? But the real dice comes in the statistical methodology that people now use because of the lack of response to the polls, basically. And what this is that, simply enough, people just aren't responding to polls. So, done. And this hurts, and this makes it really hard. It makes it really hard to get what's called a representative sample. And the entire basis of these statistical modeling and these regression models is a representative sample. And that means that you're not surveying the entire population, you're surveying a sample. It's the same way that if you're making a pot of stew, you don't need to eat the entire pot of stew to know what it tastes like. You taste it. And you're like, oh, it's too salty, And if this bite is too salty, you can assume that the rest of it is too salty. And so, you add some vinegar to even that out, or sugar, or whatever you want to do. So that's like the theory, right? Is this representative sampling, and it's all based off of that. And back in the polling heyday, it was pretty easy to get a representative sample. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, you could call a home and around dinner time, and the person would usually pick up, and they would be okay with talking to you, and they would say, yeah, I love whoever's Reagan's policy on this. I don't like his policy on that. I feel good about him. I feel bad about him, whatever it is. And you could get a pretty good picture. Response rates were probably in the 35%-ish. 26 to 35%-ish, okay? And then you had the 90s come along with kind of computers and random digit dialing, and you have this like mix, right? This marriage of technology and methodology, and it's just working great, And then, of course, the 2000s come along, and early 2000s, it's actually still working. You've still got you have some more technology, you've got more computers, but what happens is that the response rates plummet. They go from that 36% to like 20%, and then even by 2016, already response rates were down to like single digits, 7, 8, 9%. So you got to make a lot more phone calls, and you're just getting fewer and fewer people. And the reason for this is, cell phones, basically. Broadly speaking, it's cell phones. I don't know what robocalls were called back then, but I was alive. It's not like spam calls, or was that what we had? Okay. But essentially, like the increase of cell phones, people like not being home as much, life factors or whatever. So response rates plummet. And this is what happens in 2016. Well, actually, no, this is not what happens in 2016. This is happening, right? So number one, we've got response rates are plummeting. Just fewer and fewer and fewer people are answering. And so when fewer people answer, you get a smaller sample size, right? And a smaller sample size means you're less likely to get a representative sample. Again, like, let's go back to our stew. If you take a tiny little sip of the stew when you just get the broth, then you might not know that there are beans in that stew. There could be red beans or kidney beans. There could be black beans. There could be black-eyed peas. But you have no idea, right? You don't know that those beans are in that stew because the tiny taste that you had was just broth. And it was delicious, and it, was salty enough, but there were no beans in that broth. So this is the problem, right? Is that how are you supposed to know that this stew has beans? Or, for instance, what a black man thinks of a candidate if you're not reaching any black men. So what they do, and what pollsters do to fix this issue, is something called weighting. Now, something happening outside. Anyway, sorry. So weighting is, it's not hard to explain, right? It's easy to explain, and it's not bad, is the other thing that I want to first put out. It's not bad. It statistically, mathematically makes a ton of sense. And essentially what that is like, let's say you call 100 people, but you end up getting 60 men and only 40 women. Now, you know that this doesn't represent the population, right? You know that the population is more like 52% women and not 40% women. So what do? So what you do is that you multiply each woman's response by a small coefficient, by a small multiplier that makes their response be a little bit more heavily weighted in your equation, so that, or you might do a smaller weight on the men's response also. I think you could probably do it both ways. I don't know, but I'm sure that there's a standard, and I'm sure that's easily looked about. But anyway, so you basically affix a small number to each woman's vote, so that instead of it counting as like one vote, or one response, one person, it counts as like 1.01, right? Or 1.1, or depending on, again, how off your sample size is. And they do this with the gender, and they do this with age, and they do this with, income level, and they do this with a lot of different things, with a lot of your basic demographics. And this is how they get a more representative sample, or a sample that, mathematically speaking, is more reflective of the general population. And weighting work, and as I said, weighting, works well until it doesn't. Which is what happened in 2016. And because what happened in 2016 is that the polls all vastly, vastly overestimated Trump. Overestimated Clinton, underestimated Trump. And what the line is, and the reason for this, is because while the polls weighted, again, this is because we've got non-response, right? Because we have so few people responding. So the problem is that we've got few people responding. The solution is the weighting of the demographic variables. But what they didn't do is they didn't weight by what turned out to be the most important demographic variable in somebody's choice for Clinton or Trump in 2016. And that was that was college education. Who knew, right? And this kind of like goes back, is that, again, there was an issue or a problem or a sort of a societal trend that wasn't anticipated and wasn't known to pollsters beforehand. It was only known after the election. So after the election, when they went back and they re-weighted all of their models based off of college education, they were more accurate. The polls were more accurate. But they only had that knowledge after the election results. But so, as what they did is they went and they fixed the problem, right? So in 2016, they were like, we should have weighted by college level, And just as I've talked about this trend before in the Democrats, is always one election cycle behind. They went and they did that for 2020, and they were like, great, fixed the problem. We've weighted by, who knew that a college degree was such an important factor these days, these years. But now we know, and we fixed it. So polls should be great. And so what happens in 2020? Well, Biden wins. Spoiler alert. He does win, and the polls predicted a Biden win, right? They did, they were Biden win, but they predicted a landslide win. They predicted a trouncing. And that's not what happened. It wasn't a trouncing. Biden eked his victory out. There were a bunch of swing states that he lost that the polls kind of like thought that he was going to win. Mm, and so once again, the polls underestimated Trump support and overestimated Biden support. So the pollsters go back and they're like, oh, this happened again. That's so weird. What's going on? And so what did they do? They add more weights. And this time, however, they were like, okay, so I realized they realized that like the education was no longer, that the education issue was no longer the issue. The real issue is that Trump voters are less likely to respond to polls than Biden Harris voters. Huh. Okay. So, and I think that they realized that I think they realized that right after 2020. They were like, okay, like this is bigger, right? The bigger issue here is it's not just that we're getting less respondents. It's that the people who are responding are overwhelmingly Democratic, right? It's the liberal elite who are actually the ones who are like, yeah, I'll respond to your poll. I like go Harris or whatever. And it's the Republicans or the leaning Trump voters who are like, don't text me, don't call me, get out of my face. I don't want to talk to you. And this was the trend, right? And so what they decide to do in their infinite mathematical wisdom is that they decide to add another weight. And the weight that they add this time is recalled vote. Or party registration, right? I think it was like recalled vote and party registration. Recalled vote is, they would say, who do you plan to vote for? And then they'd be like, who did you vote for last time? And then they would also be like, what's your party registration? Because it turns out that the most accurate predictor of who you're going to vote for is your party registration, is your party ID. Now, of course, this is changing as well, because this country is not a 50-50 country in terms of Democrat and Republican. There have been some polls that tell us that up to 45% of people actually identify as independent. Now, I've generally, I think the trend has been 30-30-30 over the past few years. I'm not surprised that a lot of people identify as independent. I think a lot of that party registration also has to do because of primaries. Like, you sort of have to be a registered Democrat or Republican if you want to participate in your primaries. So people who are politically involved are more likely to register as one or the other, even if they don't identify particularly strongly with one of the parties. But that's a sidestep. The point being is that in 2024, they've now waited for recalled vote, party identification, in order to hope that their sample size, which is drastically underrepresentative of Republican and Trump voters, will now reflect more of the population because of this waiting. So what happens? Well, once again, the same thing happens, right? The polls overestimate Harris's support. Now, in 2024, not by as much, okay? So they closed the gap. Absolutely, they did. They've closed this gap a little bit, and they have, but they still overestimated Harris's support, right? They were like, Harris is going to win a couple of these states or a couple of those states or whatever. I think they still had her. I don't know what they had her in the popular vote or not, but regardless, they sort of still did it. They still drastically overestimated her. And the other thing that they did on a state level, or maybe it was a county level, I don't know, is that they also assumed the same turnout as before the last election, right? So they kind of assumed there would be a similar turnout in 2024 than there was in 2020. So what's happening here, right? So what am I getting at through all of this? Well, on the turnout issue, before I go into my broad strokes, so the turnout issue is actually an interesting one, because the election is sort of decided on the turnout issue. It's decided by the people who choose to vote or don't choose to vote in that election, having had less reliable election results or election participation previously. What I mean by this is that, like, we have a pretty solid idea. If somebody has voted Democrat in the past 8 elections, you have a pretty solid idea that they're going to vote Democrat, right? Even if somebody has voted Democrat in the past 3 elections, you can still pretty much assume that they're going to vote Democrat, right? The election is won or lost in the people who don't vote and who choose to vote. It's the people who show up who haven't historically showed up, right? Who are these 100 million or so voters who don't vote. And it's those people, and it's whether or not they turn out or not. And so, for instance, there were Trump counties. There were counties that voted for Trump, which surged in turnout. And then there were counties that voted for Biden, which plummeted in turnout. And that is, I think, an interesting story. And that is something that the polls missed, because they were just assuming it would be the same turnout. But what happened was, and, I think there was one Michigan county, I believe, who went 20 percentage points for Biden in 2020, and then Harris won it, but she only won by 4, right? And so what's the story there? Like, why is that? And, if you follow the news, or if you know, then you would know that, Michigan was a state that Harris did a terrible job talking about Israel and Palestine. I mean, not in that state. She did a terrible job, nationally. But Michigan was a state where it was very, very concerning and was a huge political issue for the population because of its large Arab American population. So if you could these are things that, if you're following the trend lines in the news, and you could say, oh, well, maybe we should discuss this. Maybe we should factor in a lower turnout in Michigan, or in this county in Michigan, because there's a lot of drop-off. There's going to be a lot of drop-off of people who voted for Biden who are not going to vote for Kamala Harris because of her stance, her support of Israel, and her refusal to label it a genocide. But that's not what pollsters do, right? They don't do that. What they do is that they weight by, what was it? Oh, it was Gen Z. Okay, sorry. It wasn't a county, it was Gen Z. It was Gen Z favored Harris by 4 points in 2024 versus Biden and 25 points in 2020. So it was a whole generation. It wasn't even a state. It wasn't even Michigan. Oh my God, sorry, I got that so wrong. Glad I took that note. Put that note down there. Anyway, point is, right, is that what polls are doing is that they're making these broad generalizations, and they are, okay, sorry, that's a separate issue. This point is with the weighting, right? Back to the weights. So what's happening here is that because of the fundamental flaw, which is that they can't get enough people to respond to their questions. That's it. They can't get them on landlines, they can't get them on cell phones, they can't get them in texts, they can't get them paid, they can't get them online ads. They just can't get enough people to respond to make it a representative sample. And on top of that, they can't get enough. The people that they are getting happen to also align with their vote preference, which is a pretty new phenomenon as well. It wasn't always like that, right? It was always kind of like just as many Democrats as Republicans wouldn't respond. So that 70% of the population that didn't respond, they were equally split among Democrats and Republicans, or more importantly, the 30% that did respond were equally split. That has also changed. So now, not only is your response rate like 0.4% in some polls, or 1% in some polls, that 1% of people are going to be drastically skewed towards people who trust the media, people who trust the institutions, people who want to engage with politics, and all of people who are highly educated, people who are rich, people who have free time, all of this kind of lines up with the Democratic demographics. So, and given that this is the problem, and the pollsters just keep trying to weight their way out of it, right? They keep trying to add these fancy methods and statistics and all of this stuff to make their models more accurate. But the problem is that the more stuff and the more complicated you make your equations, the less accurate they get. So this is where we're at right now, is that they keep piling on these fancy techniques and these different variables, hoping that it's going to make it more accurate, but actually what it's doing is it's making it more likely to have errors, and it's making it less accurate. So that's where we're at, right? So we're at this weird spot where we're not really sure what's going to happen, let's see. And this kind of goes back to my initial point, which is that it's not just the polls, it's the way we talk about polls. It's giving these very specific numbers to a thing that shouldn't have specific numbers. I kind of think about it like a color or like a mood vibe. Like you could tell the difference between red and green, right? Look at that, red and green. You can tell the difference, right? And you can tell, and so just like you can tell the difference where like, if Biden is 78% approval rating versus 20% approval rating, like, yeah, that's fair, right? You could be like, yo, this guy is like really gone down in approval rating. Like 70% of people used to think that he was great, and now like 20% think that he's great. Like that's red and green, right? That's a drastic change, and you could be like, okay, people are not happy with him. The vibes are off here. But can you tell the exact moment that red turns to orange, or the difference between an orangish red and a reddish orange. And that's what we're talking about when we're saying 36% versus 34%. Uh, no, you can't. You can't accurately say that 2 points is anything. And so when you have these races that are super, super close, which they have been over the past few years, to put these numerical labels on them is a disservice, and it is false advertising. And this is what we need to restructure and rethink, is that we have to talk about the polls in a different way until AI comes along and gives us a completely different methodology, which I don't think is far off, actually. You know, it's pretty clear that like survey response don't work anymore. But the truth is that we have so much personal data, right? We have so much information about people, is that you can probably a better predictor of whether somebody is going to vote for Trump or whoever, not Trump, is their shopping habits, you know, is their TV watching habits, you know, like there's all of this data. There's all like, just look at somebody's feed, look at their Instagram feed, done. You know, you can figure out who they're going to vote for and if they're going to vote probably from that, you know, and so there, and of course, like, listen, there are, and this is what market research does, right? This is exactly what commercial market research does, is it uses people's consumer information and their content information to figure out whether they are likely or not to buy your product. It's the same thing, right? So we can absolutely do that with, okay, I mean, I would argue, if I'm really going to get into it, then none of this shit should be happening. The only thing you should be measuring is policy preference and issues. We should be asking people if they want free universal health care or childcare or subsidized groceries or healthy food and healthy drinking water. You know, it's like this is what we should be polling people on, is the policies, not in a matchup between Trump and XYZ, who, if the election was held today, who would you rather vote for? All that shit is stupid media shit, right? So, but this is what I mean when I say the pollsters are the ones who are doing us a disservice. They are the ones that should be reformulating the conversation and should be talking about it in a much, much different way. And I think that, again, we have an opportunity now with AI, with changing methodologies, with changing demographics, to come up with a new frame in which we discuss public opinion. Because public opinion is important. And I'm not saying that it is. It's just the way that we're discussing it has become so toxic and terrible that it's not contributing to our whole electoral system. And that, to me, is kind of like the bottom line of the polls. So I hope that was informative. Sorry if it wasn't. Thanks. Bye.